Hello children, this is Manik sir. So my dear children, today I shall be presenting you the remaining part of the non-cooperations movement. So my dear children, in today's videos lectures, we shall learn in details how as well as why the non-cooperations movement which was begun in Andhra Pradesh or which was begun among the tribal peoples of Andhra Pradesh. So dear children, in our previous videos lectures, we had learned in details that the non-cooperations movement was started with the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, and it was started in towns and cities. And when it was started with boycotting the services and peoples that stopped using the foreign goods, because Gandhiji had convinced the peoples that if we are no longer going to have cooperations with the British government, then the British powers will be collapsed within a period of 1 year and Swaraj will come into being. So my dear children, when the movement was getting very effective in town area, due to certain factors, the movement seems to be failure. Because when Gandhiji called as well as convinced the peoples not to use the foreign goods and to use the Swadeshi goods, during that time the mill-made goods was very cheaper than the handmade goods in Indian society. So dear children, it was not at all possible for the common peoples to utilize the Swadeshi goods in Indian society, and due to that factors we see that the non-cooperations movement in towns and city, it was seems to be failure. Why? Because the poor peoples, they were not able to afford and they were not able to purchase the khadi cloth, because Gandhiji convinced peoples to use the Swadeshi goods, but the poor peoples were not at all able to afford the Swadeshi goods in Indian society, and because of those factors the non-cooperations movements in towns and cities seems to be failure. So my dear children, when it was seems to be failure, we see many teachers, lawyers who had given their resignations as well as stopped using the legal practices, again they rejoined with the British. So my dear children, even though these non-cooperations movements in towns and cities seems to be failure, but the ideas as well as the messages which spread all over the nations, and when it was spreading to all over the nations, it given a strong inspirations among the people to carry forward the non-cooperations movement in Indian society. So in my previous videos lectures, my dear children, I have explained to you in details the peasants movement in Awadh. The peasants of Awadh were going through a very hard time. They were facing a lot of challenges. They were not given any kind of rights in the society. They were oppressed by the landlords, and due to that, with the leaderships of many freedom fighters like Baba Ramachandra, we see the peasants movement had begun in Awadh, and after that we see the Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, he went to several places, understood the grievances of the Kishans, and he formed the Awadh Kisan Sabha. And within a period of 1 month, we see the Kisan Sabha seems to be 300 branches in many parts. So my dear children, so these non-cooperations movements, it had began in Andhra Pradesh also. Because why it was begun? When the tribal peoples were oppressed by the colonial government, the tribal peoples had begun the non-cooperations movement in Andhra Pradesh. So here the tribal peoples, they had also understood the concept of Swaraj. They also understood the concept of Gandhiji, the idea of Swaraj, and they interpreted the message of Gandhiji by using the ideology of Swaraj, self-rule. So my dear children, in the Gudem hills of Andhra Pradesh, Gudem hills of Andhra Pradesh, there was a militant guerrilla movement which was spread in 1920. So dear children, here, why the movement was started among the tribal peoples? What was the causes which had prompted them to start the non-cooperations movements? So here, according to the history, we have learned that it is the colonial government, it is the British government who had closed the large forest area. So when the British government forbidden the tribals not to enter into the forest area, during that time it questions their sense of pride as well as their sense of authority. Because here we see that the tribal peoples who have a emotional attachment with the forest area, who had a very strong attachments towards the forest area, because they used to take most of the resources from the forest area and they used to make their livelihood and they used to have better life in the society. So my dear children, when the British government had closed the forest area, when these tribal peoples were not allowed to enter into the forest area to graze their animals, to take the resources, to take the fruits, to take the fuel wood, during that time these tribal peoples were threatened. They were having very strong feelings of disagreement with the British government. Why? Because I have already told you that the tribal peoples had a very close connections with the forest area, and when the forest areas were forbidden to enter into those areas, during that time they began to felt very bad, because they were having all kinds of economic activities, collecting the resources from the forest area, then grazing their animals, taking the resources from the forest area, and when they were strictly forbidden not to enter into the forest area, it really made them very anger. And when these peoples were not allowed, it enraged them to question their livelihood as well as their traditional rights, which these tribal peoples were having rights from the birth. So my dear children, the tribal peoples, they used to go to forest, collect the resources, used to have different kind of economical activities, but when they were not given permissions to enter into the forest area, it questions their economical activities, and with that they felt very bad, they became very angry, and further these tribal peoples were forcefully asked to contribute for road building, and during that time they began to be very angry and they started revolting against the British government. So my dear children, it's a very natural thing. Why? When someone's livelihood is questioned, when someone's traditional rights has been questioned, during that time it seems to be one kind of failure, it seems to be one kind of things which will make them to be dissatisfied with their life. And when these peoples were not allowed to enter into the forest area, during that time they became very, very angry with the British government and they started revolting against the British government. So, dear children, when the Britishers attacked the livelihood of the tribal peoples, during that time they saw it as the attack on their livelihood as well as the birthright of the tribal peoples. So, dear children, the tribal peoples, they started revolting against the Britishers, and the movement was getting very, very effective with the leadership of Alluri Sitaram Raju. So here the tribal leaders Alluri Sitaram Raju was having a very strong commitment. He was the one who given the perfect leaderships to the tribal peoples to start revolting against the Britisher. And here we see these Aluri Sitaram Raju, the tribal leaders who is having a very special characters, is very special character that he himself was considering and declaring that he is having a special power and he could make the astrological predictions correctly. At the same time, he can heal people and he could survive even he has been hit with bullet shots. So my dear children, here we see the special character of the tribal leaders called Aluri Sitaram Raju, who is having a special powers, convincing the peoples that he can make a correct astrological predictions, he can heal the peoples, he could survive even with the bullet shots. So he is the one who given leaderships to the peoples to do revolting against the British government. Why the revolt was started? Already, my dear children, I have told you that when the British government did not allow the tribal peoples to enter into the forest area, they felt that it is the attack on their livelihood, it is the attack on their birthright, and with that they became very angry and they started revolting against the British government. So here, being the leaders of the tribal community, we see the Aluri Sitaram Raju, who was convincing the peoples, persuading the peoples, giving leaderships to the peoples, and he was the one who was leading the community, and he was persuading strongly peoples to wear the khadi cloth, to use the Swadeshi goods, and also he was convincing peoples not to have drinking habits. He was convincing peoples to give up the habit of drinking. So here we see the dynamic leaderships who had given by Aluri Sitaram Raju. He is convincing the tribal peoples not to have drinking. He is convincing the tribal peoples to wear khadi cloth. He is motivating them, giving them leadership. Then he is pursuing them to start the Swaraj movements, because he is strongly interpreting the message of Gandhiji to the common peoples. And when he was convincing the peoples that he could do many things in the society, that is such as he could make correct astrological predictions, could heal peoples, at the same time he can survive even after he is hit by bullet shots. So my dear children, further he said that the Indian society could get the freedom only through the use of force, not through non-violence movements. So he was forcing people to start the revolt. He was forcing people to start the revolt against the Britisher, because according to his ideology, the freedoms can be possible only through the use of force, not through non-violence. So my dear children, here in this Golden Hills rebels, how they started the revolt? They attacking the police stations. They attempted to kill the British officials. At the same time, they started to have the guerrilla warfare in order to achieve Swaraj in the society. So my dear children, how they started revolting against the Britisher? They attacked the police officer, they attacked the police stations, they attacked and tried to kill the British officer. At the same time, they adopted the methods of having the ideas of guerrilla warfare in order to get Swaraj in the society. So my dear children, when this Aluri Sitaram Raju was continuously leading the peoples to start revolting against the Britisher. Finally, in 1924, he was captured by the Britishers and he was executed in 1924. So my dear children, so here we understood that there was a strong leadership given by Alluri Sitaram Raju in order to liberate the tribal peoples in Andhra Pradesh, because the tribal peoples were not allowed to enter into the forest area. It questions their livelihood, it attacked their livelihood, it questions their birthright, and that is the reasons we see the non-cooperations movement which had begun in Andhra Pradesh with the leadership of Alluri Sitaram Raju. So my dear children, when the tribal peoples were not given permissions to enter into the forest area, they started revolting against the British government. Thank you so much for listening to me.